Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his...
The quietest royal figures are often the easiest to overlook, until one carefully placed gesture changes the entire conversation. Now, reports surrounding Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, Queen Camilla, and Prince William's future coronation have raised a question no palace statement has answered. Was this simply royal protocol, or did Edward quietly draw a line around the next reign? At first glance, Prince Edward does not seem like the sort of figure who would stand at the center of a royal power story. For decades, he has occupied one of the monarchy's most disciplined but least dramatic roles. He appears, he serves, he supports the crown, and then he steps back before the attention can fully settle on him. In a family often shaped by headline-making personalities, Edward has built his reputation through steadiness rather than spectacle. And that is exactly why this reported story has become so intriguing. According to royal commentary and online discussion, whispers have grown around whether Edward may have quietly blocked or resisted Queen Camilla's expected prominence in connection with Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and his future coronation. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed such a move, and no official coronation plan for William has been publicly announced. But the speculation has gained attention because it touches one of the most sensitive questions inside any monarchy: who will be placed closest to power when the next reign begins? That question may sound distant, but inside royal circles, the future is never left until the last moment. Coronations are not improvised. They are shaped through tradition, rank, family position, public perception, and years of careful preparation. Long before the doors of Westminster Abbey open for a new sovereign, the palace has already considered the images the world will see, the people who will stand closest, and the symbols that will define the moment. That is where the tension begins. Queen Camilla is the wife of King Charles III and the queen of the current reign. Her place beside the king is formal, visible, and carefully established. After decades of public scrutiny, she has secured a role that once seemed almost impossible to imagine. Yet her position in Prince William's future reign is a more delicate question. When William becomes king, Catherine, Princess of Wales, will become queen beside him, and Camilla will belong to the previous chapter of royal history. That does not mean she disappears. It does not mean she loses dignity. But it does mean the emotional center of the monarchy changes. For many royal watchers, this is where Prince Edward becomes important. He represents something different from Camilla, different from William, and different from the more dramatic branches of the family. Edward represents disciplined service, continuity from the late Queen Elizabeth II's generation, and a form of loyalty that rarely draws attention to itself. His connection to Prince Philip's legacy, through the title Duke of Edinburgh, gives him a quiet symbolic weight that should not be underestimated. So if reports are accurate that Edward has become involved in questions of coronation positioning, ceremonial influence, or the future shape of the royal household, the meaning would go far beyond one family preference. It would suggest that one of the monarchy's most understated figures may now be helping protect the image of William's coming reign. But was this really about blocking Camilla, or was it about preserving the future crown from confusion? That distinction matters. A royal coronation is not only a religious and constitutional ceremony. It is the moment when a reign is visually defined for history. Every person placed near the new king becomes part of the public memory of that day. Every jewel, every robe, every seat, every brooch, and every family grouping carries meaning. Nothing is casual when the world is watching a crown pass from one generation to the next. That may explain why the reported brooch detail has drawn so much attention. In royal life, brooches are rarely meaningless. They can signal loyalty, remembrance, dynastic identity, and personal alignment. When Queen Camilla wears a brooch linked to royal authority or to the symbols of King Charles's reign, some observers see it as a statement of her place within the present monarchy. It is a quiet form of visual language, and the palace has always understood the power of such details. But if a brooch can signal belonging, then its appearance in a story about William's future coronation becomes even more sensitive. Because the question is no longer simply what Camilla wears now. It becomes what symbols she may expect to carry into the next reign, and whether those symbols would strengthen or complicate the public image of William and Catherine's monarchy. Prince Edward's alleged role, if true, would therefore not be loud or theatrical. It would fit the way he has always operated. Edward does not need to challenge anyone publicly. He does not need to issue dramatic statements. His influence, if it is growing, would appear through presence, restraint, and careful alignment. A quiet word, a careful absence, a position beside William at the right moment, a refusal to allow the future coronation image to become clouded by unresolved memories from the current reign. And this is what makes the story so powerful for viewers who have followed the royal family for decades. The monarchy is not only a family, it is an institution built on continuity. When one reign moves toward another, the palace must decide not only who belongs in the photographs, but what those photographs will say to the nation. Will they show unity? Will they show transition? Will they show a clean beginning for William and Catherine, or a complicated overlap with the past? That is why Camilla's position in this alleged story is so sensitive. She is not simply a royal figure being discussed in isolation. She is a symbol of Charles's personal history, his long road to the throne, and the public's gradual acceptance of a relationship that once divided opinion. To include her too prominently in William's future coronation imagery could be seen by some as continuity. To others, it could feel like the previous reign reaching too far into the next one. And for Edward, whose loyalty has always seemed tied more to the institution than to personal drama, that may be exactly the kind of complication he would want to avoid. Some royal watchers believe the Duke of Edinburgh has become more significant precisely because he is not viewed as ambitious. His public image is calm, dutiful, and relatively untouched by the scandals that have damaged other parts of the family. Alongside Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, he has increasingly appeared as a dependable working royal, someone who can support the crown without pulling the spotlight away from the monarch or the heir. That kind of reliability matters at a time when the monarchy is preparing for its next emotional transformation. Still, the central mystery remains unresolved. Has Prince Edward truly taken a quiet stand over Camilla's future ceremonial role, or are observers reading too much into subtle palace signals, symbolic jewelry, and careful positioning? To understand why this reported brooch shock has stirred so much interest, we have to look at what was quietly building around Edward long before the public noticed. Campaign for attention, but something far more useful inside the royal family, trust that had accumulated almost unnoticed. For years, while louder figures absorbed public fascination, the Duke of Edinburgh remained in the background, taking on duties without transforming them into personal drama. And in a monarchy exhausted by scandal, tension, and transition, that kind of steadiness can become its own form of influence. This is why the reported coronation dispute, whether fully accurate or partly shaped by speculation, has captured so much interest. Edward is not usually associated with palace confrontation. He is not the royal who appears to challenge the system, test the boundaries, or create public waves. His power, if it can be called power, has always been softer and more institutional. He represents the kind of loyalty that does not need to announce itself, and that may be precisely why his alleged resistance to Camilla's future role feels significant. Because when someone known for restraint appears to draw a line, people naturally ask what forced that line to appear. The deeper context is the changing shape of the working royal family. Over recent years, the monarchy has been forced to rely more heavily on a smaller group of dependable figures. The departure of Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, from frontline royal life changed one part of the picture. The controversy surrounding Prince Andrew changed another. Health challenges within the senior royal household added further pressure. Suddenly, the institution needed those who could appear, serve, and remain publicly reliable without bringing additional complication. Edward and Sophie became increasingly valuable in that environment. Their strength was not star power, it was consistency. They could represent the crown without overshadowing it. They could step into formal roles without turning the occasion into a personal story. They could support Charles while also remaining acceptable to the public as figures who belonged to the wider continuity of the late Queen's family. That matters because coronation planning, even when unofficial or future-facing, is never just about rank. It is about atmosphere. When William's reign eventually begins, the palace will need to create an image of renewal, steadiness, and clean continuity. The question is not only who has a technical right to be present. The question is who strengthens the picture and who risks pulling the public's mind backward into old tensions. That is where Camilla's position becomes complicated. She belongs beside Charles in the current reign, and her role has been carefully built around that fact. But William's future coronation would not be a celebration of Charles's personal journey. It would be the beginning of a different monarchy, one centered on William and Catherine. Any figure placed too prominently within that future scene would inevitably be read as part of its message. And this is why the alleged brooch shock carries symbolic force. A brooch may seem small to casual viewers, but in royal presentation it can work like a sentence written in jewels. It can point to loyalty, lineage, remembrance, or authority. When Camilla wears pieces associated with the king's identity, or the present reign, observers often interpret them as visual reinforcement of her place beside Charles. That may be entirely appropriate within the current monarchy. But if similar symbols appear in conversations around William's future coronation, the meaning becomes more delicate. Was the brooch simply a personal emblem, or was it being read as a claim of continued ceremonial influence? That question opens a wider issue. If Camilla is seen as carrying too much of Charles's reign into William's coronation image, the palace risks confusing the emotional message of the next era. A coronation must look forward, even as it honors the past. It must include family, but not allow family history to overpower the new sovereign. It must balance respect for the former reign with the unmistakable arrival of the new one. That balance is easy to describe and incredibly difficult to achieve. Edward's alleged concern, if royal watchers are interpreting the situation correctly, may not be personal opposition to Camilla at all. It may be institutional caution. He may understand that William's future reign will need clarity from the first image. The world must see the new king, the new queen, and the trusted figures surrounding them without wondering whether unresolved emotional history is still influencing the frame. That is why Edward's position is so interesting. He does not need to be central to the throne to matter to the transition. In fact, his distance from the direct line may make him more useful. He can serve as a stabilizing figure without appearing to seek the crown's glow for himself. He can support William without being seen as a rival. He can represent the late Queen and Prince Philip's generation without carrying the complications that surround other senior relatives. Sophie's role adds another layer. As the Duchess of Edinburgh, she has often been viewed as one of the more trusted and composed members of the modern royal household. Her public image is polished but not theatrical, warm but not overexposed. Together, she and Edward offer the palace something rare: reliability without chaos. And in a future coronation setting, that kind of reliability may be more valuable than rank alone. But the question then becomes sharper. If Edward and Sophie are increasingly seen as safe figures for William's era, what does that mean for those whose public image remains more divided? That is where public perception enters the story. Royal influence is not decided only inside palace walls. It is also shaped by how the public responds to each figure over time. Camilla has worked for years to secure acceptance, and many now recognize her service beside Charles. Yet acceptance is not the same as emotional enthusiasm, and royal observers know that a coronation depends heavily on emotional clarity. The public needs to feel that the new reign is beginning with confidence, not hesitation. For William and Catherine, that clarity is essential. Their future monarchy will be judged from the beginning by whether it feels modern enough to survive and traditional enough to reassure. They will need a supporting circle that strengthens their image rather than complicates it. If Edward has truly become more protective of that future circle, then his alleged actions may be less about exclusion and more about careful construction. Still, nothing has been officially confirmed. Buckingham Palace has not announced plans suggesting that Camilla has been blocked from anything connected to William's future coronation. The more dramatic claims remain speculative, but the reason they resonate is because they reflect a real royal truth. The next reign is already being imagined, and the people who appear closest to it are being watched with new intensity. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the story moved into far more sensitive territory. Because behind the question of one brooch, one coronation, or one alleged intervention, another issue was beginning to emerge: whether Edward's quiet loyalty is becoming one of the hidden forces shaping who will stand at the heart of William's future monarchy. If Edward's quiet loyalty is becoming one of the hidden forces shaping William's future monarchy, then the story is no longer about one brooch, one ceremony, or one rumored disagreement. It becomes a story about how the royal family prepares for change before the public is allowed to see the full design. That is where the dots begin to connect. Edward's value inside the institution does not come from being close to the throne. It comes from being close to the habits that kept the monarchy steady under the late Queen. He was raised within a household where duty was rarely sentimental, where service was expected rather than celebrated, and where public restraint was treated as a form of discipline. That background gives him a kind of credibility that is difficult to manufacture. And in the present moment, credibility matters. The monarchy is moving through a period where every senior figure carries a different kind of weight. Charles carries the authority of the crown, but also the burden of a reign that began after decades of waiting. Camilla carries the dignity of her current role, but also the memory of a complicated public journey. William carries the expectation of the next era. Catherine carries the emotional reassurance of that future. Edward, by contrast, carries something quieter, the memory of how the old system functioned when it was at its most controlled. That may explain why some observers believe his position around William's future reign could become more important than many expected. The next monarchy will not only need glamour, youth, and popularity. It will need internal discipline. It will need older figures who can steady the family without competing with the heir. It will need relatives who understand protocol deeply enough to protect the symbolism of a new reign before anyone outside the palace notices the danger. But was Edward's alleged stance truly about Camilla, or was it about the frame around William's crown? That distinction changes everything. If this were simply personal resistance, it would risk sounding like another royal disagreement. But if it is about the future frame, then it becomes institutional. A coronation is not only a day of ceremony, it is the opening photograph of a reign. Every person placed close to the new sovereign becomes part of how history remembers the beginning. The palace cannot afford for that image to feel confused, crowded, or emotionally pulled backward. This is where Camilla's brooch symbolism becomes more sensitive. Within Charles's reign, symbols tied to his identity reinforce her place beside him. They make sense as part of the current monarchy's visual language. But William's coronation would require a different emotional vocabulary. It would need to suggest renewal without disrespecting what came before. It would need to honor Charles without making his personal story dominate William's first defining royal image. And if Edward is watching that future image with unusual care, then the alleged tension begins to look less accidental. Princess, and the Princess Royal, has long been associated with that same kind of institutional clarity, and rarely appears interested in softening difficult truths for the sake of appearances. Edward's style is gentler, but the underlying instinct may be similar. Both belong to the late Queen's generation of working discipline. Both understand that the crown survives not by indulging every personal attachment, but by protecting the structure that outlives every individual. That is a crucial point, because royal families are always tempted by personal history. They are human, even when surrounded by ancient ceremony. They carry old loyalties, old wounds, old alliances, and old grievances into rooms where the public expects perfection. The institution's task is to prevent those private histories from overwhelming the public meaning of the crown. And a future coronation is exactly the kind of moment where that task becomes almost impossibly delicate. For William, the problem is not whether Camilla should be respected. Of course, the previous reign must be respected. The deeper question is how visible that previous chapter should be at the moment his own reign begins. Too little recognition could appear cold. Too much prominence could blur the message of renewal. The future king would need a ceremony that acknowledges family continuity while making clear that the monarchy has entered a new phase. Catherine's role makes that even more important. As the future queen, she would stand at the emotional center of the new reign beside William. The public would read her presence as part of the beginning, not as a supporting detail. If the ceremony is visually shaped by unresolved tensions from Charles's era, it could weaken the clean emotional story William and Catherine would need from the very first day. That may be why Edward's alleged positioning feels so consequential. He is not powerful because he commands the spotlight. He is powerful because he can help decide where the spotlight should not fall. In monarchy, that kind of judgment can matter as much as any public speech. Knowing who should be central, who should be honored from a respectful distance, and who should not define the frame is part of the quiet architecture of royal survival. And this is where Sophie's selective visibility adds another layer. When the Duchess of Edinburgh appears beside Edward, their partnership projects calm service. When she is absent from certain moments, observers begin asking whether absence itself has become a signal. It remains unconfirmed, and illness or scheduling can explain many appearances. But repeated patterns are what royal watchers study, because inside palace life, a pattern can speak long before a statement is issued. So the larger picture begins to sharpen. Edward may not be challenging Camilla directly. He may be helping shape a future in which William and Catherine stand clearly at the center, supported by figures who strengthen the message rather than complicate it. That would not be rebellion. It would be transition management. But transition management can still create pressure, especially for those whose influence depends on remaining visible. Because once the palace begins deciding who belongs nearest to William's future crown, the question stops being ceremonial and becomes deeply political in the royal sense. It becomes about trust, public emotion, family memory, and the invisible boundaries around the next reign. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the situation moved into far more dangerous territory, because the real question was no longer who would attend a future coronation. It was who might be quietly kept from defining it. The danger of being quietly kept from defining a future coronation is that it does not have to happen through a public rejection. In the royal family, exclusion can arrive softly through a changed seating plan, a reduced ceremonial role, a different camera frame, or a decision never explained because it was never meant to be debated in public. That is why the reported Edward question has become so consequential. If the Duke of Edinburgh is indeed being viewed as a stabilizing force around William's future reign, then his influence would not need to look dramatic. It would appear in the slow formation of a trusted circle, the kind that becomes obvious only when the same faces keep appearing in the right places. Within that circle, the contrast with Camilla becomes sharper. Her current authority comes through Charles, tied to his reign, his history, and the long public journey that brought them both to the throne. That gives her a senior place now, but it also creates a question for the next reign. When William becomes king, how much of Charles's personal chapter should remain visible at the center of the new monarchy? Should Camilla be presented as a respected elder of the family, or as a continuing ceremonial figure close to the crown? Some royal watchers believe this is where Edward's alleged intervention, if it happened, may carry its strongest meaning. It may not have been about humiliating Camilla or pushing her out of royal life. It may have been about preventing the future coronation from becoming visually divided between old loyalties and new expectations. The monarchy can honor the past, but a coronation cannot feel as though the past is still negotiating for space in the center of the frame. And this is where the brooch becomes more than a detail. Whether the claims around it are exaggerated or not, royal jewelry has always been used to place meaning on the body. A brooch can say allegiance, memory, rank, or belonging. If Camilla's chosen symbols are read as extensions of Charles's reign, then their presence in conversations about William's future becomes sensitive, because they can suggest continuity that may not belong to the next chapter. The palace understands this better than anyone. It knows that the first visual language of a reign can stay in public memory for decades. When William's time comes, the palace will almost certainly want a message of renewal, steadiness, family, and disciplined continuity. That message would place Catherine at the emotional center beside him, trusted working royals nearby, and Charles honored as the previous sovereign without allowing his reign to overpower the new one. And it would require Camilla's role to be handled with care. This is why the alleged story has moved beyond rumor into public meaning. People are not only asking whether Edward blocked Camilla, they are asking whether the monarchy is already deciding which figures belong to William's era and which figures must remain attached to Charles's. That question suggests the future royal household is being shaped before the public has been told to look for it. For Edward, the consequence is a sudden rise in symbolic importance. A man once treated as peripheral may now be seen as a guardian of institutional clarity. His quietness no longer reads simply as invisibility. It begins to read as discipline. His lack of controversy becomes an asset. He can stand near William without appearing to compete with him, and that makes him valuable in a family where proximity to power can easily become a story of its own. Sophie's role adds another layer because she is part of that credibility. When the Edinburghs appear together, they project composed service. When she is absent, Observers ask whether distance from specific royal settings is accidental or intentional. It remains unconfirmed, and ordinary explanations may apply. But in royal optics, repeated patterns become difficult to ignore, especially when they seem to align with a wider shift toward the Wales family. For Charles, this creates a painful institutional dilemma. He has spent years protecting Camilla's place, and his reign cannot allow her to appear casually sidelined. Yet as monarch, he must also protect the crown beyond his own lifetime. That means accepting that William's eventual reign will need its own emotional architecture, even if that architecture does not place Camilla as centrally as Charles himself might prefer. The king is not only a husband, he is custodian of the institution. Because if public opinion already views William and Catherine as the natural future, while Edward and Sophie are seen as steady supporting figures, then the palace cannot ignore the pattern. It may not be fair to Camilla, but monarchy is rarely governed by fairness alone. It is governed by survival, perception, and the need for the public to believe in what comes next. That is the strongest turning point in this story. The reported block, if accurate, would not simply be about denying Camilla a place. It would be about protecting the first impression of William's monarchy from any symbol that might pull attention backward. And if the reports are exaggerated, the public reaction still reveals something important. Many viewers can already imagine a future coronation where Edward's quiet presence feels reassuring, while Camilla's centrality feels uncertain. A future coronation may still be far away, and Buckingham Palace has confirmed nothing about the alleged dispute. But royal stories do not begin on the day the crown is placed. They begin in the years before, through positioning, loyalty, absence, and the silent decisions that teach the public who belongs closest to power. And that is where the final part of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Because the real consequence is not only whether Camilla is blocked, included, or carefully repositioned. It is what her place in William's future will reveal about whether the monarchy is prepared to protect the next reign, even if doing so means quietly closing the door on the emotional claims of the present one. If the monarchy is prepared to protect William's future reign, even at the cost of limiting the emotional claims of the present one, then the real meaning of this story becomes much larger than Camilla, Edward, or a single brooch. It becomes a question of how the crown survives when family loyalty and institutional necessity begin moving in different directions. That is the tension sitting at the center of every royal transition. A monarchy must look united, but it must also know when one chapter has to give way to another. It must respect the people who carried the current reign, while preparing the public to trust those who will carry the next. And in that delicate space between gratitude and succession, some figures become central, while others are gently moved toward the edge of the frame. For Camilla, that possibility is especially sensitive. Her entire public journey has been built around endurance, patience, and eventual recognition. She spent years moving from controversy into acceptance, from public resistance into ceremonial authority, and from being seen as an outsider to standing beside the king. That is not a small transformation. It is one of the most remarkable repositionings in modern royal history. But the question now is whether that hard-won position can travel fully into William's future, or whether it belongs mainly to Charles's reign. That does not make her role meaningless. It makes it historically specific. Camilla may remain respected, visible, and carefully included when the next reign begins. But if the palace chooses to place William and Catherine at the unmistakable emotional center, with trusted figures like Edward and Sophie nearby as symbols of steadiness, then Camilla's place may become more ceremonial than influential. Not erased, not dishonored, but repositioned. And in monarchy, repositioning can sometimes say more than any formal statement. This is why Edward's alleged role matters. He is not a rival to William. He is not a competing royal brand. He is not someone whose presence threatens to distract from the future king. That makes him useful. He can represent the discipline of the late Queen's family, while allowing William and Catherine to remain the focus. He can bring continuity without pulling the image backward into controversy. He can stand close enough to support the next reign, but not so close that he appears to claim ownership of it. That is a rare position inside the royal family. And perhaps that is why some observers believe Edward's quiet influence may grow precisely because he never seemed to seek it. In royal life, ambition can become dangerous when it is too visible. The most effective figures are often those who appear to serve without demanding reward. They become trusted not because they insist on being central, but because they can be relied upon when the center needs protection. If the reports around Camilla being blocked are exaggerated, the public reaction still reveals something important. Many viewers are already thinking about the next coronation not as a distant ceremony, but as an emotional reset for the monarchy. They are asking who will define William's era, who will stand beside Catherine, who will remain from Charles's chapter, and who will quietly fade into the background. That conversation alone shows that the future is already active in the public imagination. For Charles, this is the hardest part of kingship. He must protect the dignity of his wife while preparing the monarchy for a time when she will no longer be central. He must allow William's circle to form without making it appear that his own reign is being pushed aside. He must honor the past, preserve the present, and still give the future enough space to breathe. No monarch can avoid that tension forever. For William and Catherine, the stakes are different. Their future reign will need clarity from its earliest moments. The public will look for confidence, stability, family unity, and a sense that the crown has learned from the difficulties of recent years. If their coronation image feels calm, disciplined, and emotionally clean, it could strengthen the monarchy for a generation. If it feels crowded by unresolved old stories, it could weaken the first impression before the new reign has even begun. That is why the question of Camilla's future placement carries such weight. It is not simply about whether she is loved, disliked, included, or excluded. It is about whether her presence in William's defining ceremonial moment would help the monarchy look united, or remind the public of histories the palace may prefer to leave behind. That is a painful calculation, but royal institutions are built on such calculations. And this is where Edward becomes more than a quiet uncle on the edge of the family photograph. He becomes a symbol of the kind of support William may need: loyal, disciplined, non-threatening, and deeply connected to the old codes of service. If Edward is helping shape the boundaries around the next reign, then his influence is not loud power. It is protective power, the kind that works best when no one fully sees it until the result is already in place. Royal observers will now watch the smallest details with greater attention. They will watch where Edward stands at major family occasions. They will watch Sophie's appearances and absences. They will watch whether Camilla's symbolism remains tied mainly to Charles's reign, or whether attempts are made to carry it further. And most of all, they will watch how William and Catherine are framed as the monarchy slowly prepares the public for the inevitable change ahead. So what do you think? Was this simply one royal rumor built around a brooch, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Is Prince Edward quietly protecting William's future reign, or are observers reading too much into palace positioning and royal symbolism? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the royal family, the future is not always shaped by the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it is protected by the quietest figure standing just outside the crown's shadow.